Welcome to Stephen Foster at 200. I'm your co-host, Jennie Lightwise-Goff. Today, we talk with Jim Davis, professor of musicology and chair of the music history area at SUNY Fredonia. Jim has written extensively about the music of the Civil War, expanding our conceptions of the fireside music of the front line, the fiddles and fifes of documentaries and films that represent the period. Jim and I have a wide-ranging conversation not only about the music that Civil War soldiers knew, but also about what the 19th century sounded like. We don't sing on this podcast, but we do visit some familiar tunes, from evolutions and adaptations of Jesus Loves the Little Children to the band's The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. How has the Civil War been represented or misrepresented in American popular music?
An interesting question. Probably way more complex than we have time to answer. As a historian, I'm a little more biased on songs from the time period and how they've been received as opposed to songs written in the last 50 or 60 years. But it's a fun question because I do think that Civil War songs, misrepresented is a hard word, but I do believe that Civil War music has been simplified, for lack of a better word, over the years. And I kind of mean that two ways. The first is that you could argue the Civil War has been boiled down to two pieces: Battle Hymn of the Republic and Dixie. There it is. You summarize the conflict, you throw those out, and everybody knows what you're talking about. From a historian standpoint, that's unfortunate because the war was extremely complex in so many ways. Getting over the revisionist stories about whether or not slavery was the cause of the war and all that stuff, it really was a complex situation with a lot of factors. And those factors resonate in the music of the time. There are a lot of people with various views about the war, and they were drawn to different musics that had different messages and different meanings in their life. And to boil it down to Dixie and Battle Hymn is unfortunate. It covers up the rich depth of music making at the time.
I wonder, too, if that also covers music making after the time, right? So this time last year, there was a rumor that Martin Scorsese's The Last Waltz was about to leave all streaming platforms, and I must have watched it 20 times, right? Yeah. With a fear that it was about to disappear. And one of the things I realized was like, wow, the band's Night They Drove Old Dixie Down is a lot more complicated song than I remembered, especially when I started listening to the covers. Not least of all, I would really have to recommend Richie Havens' cover of it. Black American performer doing this song that I think is just not a Confederate apology at all, which is how I would have imagined it years ago. So.
And Dixie is such a great choice because at the time, the reception history of Dixie was way more complex than it is treated today. It is seen as an anthem, an emblem of the Southern Confederacy, whereas at the time, many in the Confederacy didn't accept it as an anthem for their country.
And Lincoln loved it.
Countless Northerners loved it, all the way through to the end of the war. Yeah, it was a standalone piece with little political attachment, other than that was then placed on it by certain people in certain situations. The real political meat comes 20, 30, 40 years later as all that baggage starts to accrue, and suddenly it becomes this painful emblem for so many people.
My family moved us from New York to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Appalachia in South Carolina when I was a kid. And the shock of my life, of my young life, was that one, we had a doorbell, and two, that the doorbell played Dixie.
Oh, be darned.
And that's gotten stranger with time because Appalachia is definitely not the Dixie of that song, right? Nor is it really the South in the way that people think about that.
So, right, absolutely true.
So what are the sounds that contemporary Americans associate with the war?
Something I've learned over the years is that average Americans do not consider the soundscape of any war very carefully unless they've actually been there. And you have to talk to combat vets to understand what that really entails. But the sounds during the American Civil War are probably impossible to describe. If anybody's been to a reenactment, for example, just the sound of one black fire musket going off is painfully loud. When one thinks about hundreds and thousands of these and the cannons and whatnot, and the horses and the moans of the dying and all that stuff, I think it's pretty hard for us to really understand what the soundscape of the Civil War was. Fortunately, Mark Smith, a 19th century scholar, did a wonderful book on sensory history. And it was an eye-opener for me, somebody who thought he knew what was at least partly going on. But it's a fun question because you then have to follow up with where did music fit into that soundscape? And again, I think it's hard for us to imagine an old trope for 19th century historians, but we forget in our modern day how much music back then was something you did, not something you purchased or not something you heard over the airwaves. Music was a way of shaping your own soundscape. And I do not think it's off base to claim that Civil War Americans used music in an effort to try and regain some measure of control over their soundscape.
Yeah, I do often tell my students in the second half of American literature, 19th century to the present, Reconstruction to the present, really. I said, you're not prepared for really how quiet it was and dark, or how loud the traumas, for that matter. Black Americans who were survivors of the second migration, when they describe like slave coffles, for example, the descriptions are always sonic. The sounds of pain, the sounds of movement, right? I am also grateful for Mark Smith's book, and for Mark Smith. He was my professor at University of South Carolina.
Oh, was he really?
Yes,
Oh, God.
So please, if people listening take one thing from this, please go read the sonic histories of the U.S.
Absolutely.
Was Foster part of, say, the musical sensory apparatus of a Confederate leaving North Carolina and a Union man leaving Maine, meeting on the battlefield at Gettysburg?
Yeah, it's a fun question because our understanding of Foster today is that he was omnipresent during the war, the first great American successful commercial songwriter, yada, yada. And that's true. But his role in that soundscape may not fit what a lot of people would immediately conclude, because he wasn't, especially in his early days, he wasn't a Southern composer per se. He was a nationally successful commercial songwriter. So would a young man from Maine and a young man from South Carolina marching off to war, would they both be familiar with Foster? Sure, very possibly. If there's any sort of regionalization or even politicization involved, it centers more on the popular music industry than it does on geopolitics, because Foster was a commercially successful artist, meaning published sheet music. So you look at the homes of the industry, that's where that music filters out from. So the central eastern seaboard, Foster owned it. Was that true in Missouri at the time? Maybe less. He was still known, but not to the extent that we tend to give him credit for today.
At the end of 2023, I moved to the Brazos River Valley. Alan Lomax was a professor at Texas A&M. And one of the shocking things that I learned when I was writing a piece about the blues was that making the first blues record, Dink's Song, at the Brazos River Levee Camp, Lomax thought that the record itself, which was made on wax and would have about 12 to 20 reliable plays before it fully degraded, the record is not a performance, not how he thought about it at all. It's a transcription tool so that he can make sheet music out of what Dink was doing on wax. So we have, I think, a very skewed perception of what music does, how music is transmitted.
Oh, I would absolutely agree. And Foster's a good case in point with that, because we forget that so much of his music, well, the periods of Foster's life factor in here. When he was writing all his minstrel stuff, then it was a performative music, that the audiences heard it through the performance and would walk out of it in their memories. But once he gets over that stage, it's all published sheet music, which automatically defines the audience that music is going towards, who can actually purchase it and play it and sing it. You're absolutely right. What makes him so difficult in these situations is that some of his earlier pieces or middle period pieces did enter the realm of oral tradition in a sense. So a song like Oh, Susanna or Camptown Races basically separated itself from its roots, even the sheet music, and became an oral tradition, so much so that by the turn of the century, he was being called a folk songwriter, a folk musician.
When it comes to sectional and political disputes of the age, where were Foster's loyalties?
Such a tricky one. And there are other people who are much better versed in this topic. But I can give you my answer and its relation to his music in particular. My understanding is that Foster is hard to pin down. He was intentionally ambiguous in a lot of ways. His family clearly had Southern tendencies. There's no denying that. And certainly he grew up in that environment, so probably had inclinations to some degree. But because we lack so many critical primary sources regarding Foster's views, thanks to his brother Morrison destroying all the documents, it's really hard to pin down what he really did think about all this. And so a lot of musicologists turn to the music to answer the question, which is logical. But I think that's very problematic. The fact that Foster wrote a couple of strong pro-union songs at the end of his life, I'm inclined to take less as an indication of his political loyalty and more as an indication that he's an extremely savvy commercial songwriter. He's living in New York City. He can feel the temperament of the world around him. He's not going to write a pro-Southern song in New York City at this time and hope to sell it. Instead, and I don't mean this necessarily negatively, but he's going to jump on the bandwagon. He's going to start writing pro-union tunes. He's going to reuse some lyrics from poetry that's popular at the time, which was not his norm. So I honestly, my own vision, I see Foster as mostly apolitical. I just don't think he thought about these things much.
I also wonder, I think the first president they ever made the joke about was that how could he win because I don't know anyone who voted for him. I think it was people were making that joke by the 1980s about Nixon, right? And certainly you hear it now about Trump. And I wager it was much more true in 19th century America that within a couple years of the war, nobody knew anyone who had voted for Breckinridge or McClellan. There's a way that the consensus is consolidated later, right?
I would absolutely agree, yeah.
A paratext is a literary critic's term for all the material around the book. The blurb on the book, the cover of the book, the ways that people remember the book, the characters who get cited. Even if you haven't read Catcher in the Rye, you might know Holden Caulfield. So what's your favorite Foster paratext? Where does he show up like an unexpected guest in your cultural experiences?
I will share one. It concerns George Root, another Civil War songwriter. He arguably, by the way, was much more popular than Foster. I shouldn't say popular, much more successful than Foster. He was at his peak during the Civil War. And when I first started in this field of research, past 30 years ago, I was going through all the big hits, familiarizing myself with the literature, learning what I could. So imagine my surprise when I sat down and listened to the song Tramp, which the subtitle is The Prisoner's Hope. And it's a song about POWs being released and dreaming of going home and finally getting to go home. Which, first of all, I thought was a rather bold choice for a songwriter at that time, to be honest. But also, the melody, I almost fell out of my seat. Because the melody I was intimately familiar with. It was what I knew as Jesus Loves the Little Children. It's a Sunday school tune. And that one experience, don't want to be melodramatic, but almost transformed my view of what I did, what a historian does and whatnot. That a piece of music that was so much a part of my childhood that I just took this tune for granted, in fact, had this historical context that could not be further from the use it was eventually put to. Absolutely amazed me. Still does.
When I think about the music of the Civil War, I probably have the very cliche fiddle sound of Ashokan Farewell from the beginning of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. If you were recutting that, what music would you use to introduce the war to Americans?
Good question, and it does fit with the paratext. If there's a paratext, Stephen Foster in the Civil War, it was learning how little he may have been involved from what we thought. Telling stories on myself here, but when I started this, in one of the first books I ever did, I wrote a passage that said Civil War soldiers sitting around campfires singing their favorite songs like Stephen Foster. And that's just, everybody said that. It was warranted information. Only now, a couple decades later, to look back and go, that was not true. Oh, sure, they sang some. But Stephen Foster was not necessarily a staple of Civil War soldiers in the field. I would relish the challenge, but also be afraid of the challenge of trying to put together a period soundtrack. I thought Ken Burns did a pretty darn good job, to be honest. And I think it's interesting you refer to Unger and Mason's song. I still think it's humorous that the best known piece from that documentary was a modern song. It was a contemporary song, not from the time. But I will say this, I will give Hollywood a fair amount of credit on this subject. If you go back to the movie Gettysburg, for example, they did a pretty darn good job of picking songs that were most likely the top 10 of the time without presentism kind of shaping, making sure we get our favorite songs in. Even Gone with the Wind, that soundtrack was actually fairly historically informed. But if I were to do a soundtrack, I would make sure to get all aspects of Civil War music covered. It's easy to do the anthems, but you got to remember the cheap and naive call to arms. There are a lot of tragic ballads that everybody knows from the Civil War, but there are ones from earlier in the war that you have young women proud of their men going to war. There are some political ones from both sides. There's a real melange of topics that are covered in Civil War songs from the time. And I guess I would feel obliged to make sure that one of each at least got a little bit of airplay.
Yeah, there's also the forgotten lines in the big songs, right? So we've all talked about the expurgated verse from O Susanna, but there's also the expurgated verse from the Battle Hymn of the Republic about hanging Jefferson Davis. We've got lots of forgotten pieces because of the kind of race and reunion thesis, that David Blight offers. Right. It's been really a pleasure talking to you.
Absolutely delightful. This was fun.
Stephen Foster at 200 is a companion podcast to the edited volume Stephen Foster at 200, A Critical Reappraisal. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the book for in-depth, peer-reviewed research authored by our guests. You can also check out our website, stephenfosterat200.com, for more information about the book and links to more research from our guests. This podcast is hosted by Jennie Lightwise Goff and me, Jason Lee Guthrie. I am also the executive producer. Our intro theme is by Joel Corey. O Oksana, the Russian language cover of O Susanna you're hearing now, is by Dan Vexler. Logo design by Alan Z. Support for this podcast comes from a generous grant from the Music and Entertainment Industry Educators Association. The best way for you to support the show is by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts and sharing the show on social media.